Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on Treasure Coast Solutions. Every Wednesday morning from 9 to 10 o'clock, we talk about some of the economic issues that are occurring in the world, in the U.S., in the local government, things like that may have an impact on you here in Stewart. Some of the things that may be going on that you might need to be aware of. My name is Mark Breckbill. I'm a CPA. Had my own practice for 25 years, worked for the big firms for a while, and also spent about 15 years as a banker, starting banks from scratch, and also chief financial officer of a $500 million bank at one point in time. So I've had an opportunity to see some of the financial issues that come up, especially in the banking side, and hopefully can kind of shed some light on some of the things that are going on financially and economically. It is, as I always say on Treasure Coast Solutions, it's not a financial planning show, so I'm not going to be giving you financial planning advice per se, but we are going to talk about issues that could affect your finances and your retirement and some of those kind of things, just from an overall standpoint, from an economy standpoint in terms of what's going on. So that's the gist of the show. It's not a real a difficult thing. It's just that it is a situation where it is a situation where a lot of times people just aren't exposed to some of the things that are going on. We focus sometimes on politics. We focus sometimes on the social aspects of things that are going on, but we don't always look at the economic aspects. And many of the social goals that we can't accomplish without the economics falling in line and things dropping in line from an economic standpoint. So, anyway, that's just some of the basics. If you want to participate, you can 220-9788 220-WSTU. If you want to call and add a comment or make an observation, welcome to do that. My only caution is just keep it civil, but otherwise you're free to chime in. I don't claim to know everything about everything, and I don't claim to know everything about economics or about the issues there or finance and banking, but I have been fortunate, like I said, to be exposed to some of those things. And sometimes the best and the toughest lessons that you learn are the ones that you end up learning in real life. Some of those bruises and batterings that you take in the real world, and I have a few of those scars. So it's been fortunate, but with any learning experience, it's not always the easiest in the world. So I'm hoping we can talk about some things that allow you to avoid some of that. We've been talking about a couple things over the last month or two, actually over about the last 6 months. One of which has been inflation. And, if many of you that maybe have caught the show in the past remember, probably at least 6 months ago, actually, it was almost a year ago because it was in January, so January, February, I think, somewhere in that range. I'd mentioned that I was worried about inflation and that I didn't think it was temporary. I think the term that the Fed was using at the time was transitory, which now I guess they've taken out of the vocabulary. Powell, now that he's the head of the Federal Reserve, chairman of the Federal Reserve, appointed by Biden now, has his first official act is to take the words transitory out of the definition of inflation. So I guess it's either temporary or permanent. I don't know, but it's not transitory. So, and that was, back in the early spring, Powell and Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, they were saying this would not cause inflation. All of the things that were being done, the money that was being pumped into the system, would not cause inflation. Would not, and if it did, it would be short-lived, and it would be over with as soon as it hit us. And that is not the case, of course. I had actually thought we'd be a little worse off by now. I thought we'd be looking at 30-year rates for mortgages and things like that, somewhere up around 5%, and uh, we're not there. And I think the only reason we're not there is that there's just no demand. Nobody's buying houses right now, and that's an interesting thing because if from an economic standpoint, our economy is largely based on building. For some number of years now, probably um, at least 60 or 70 years, there's this concept that everybody has the right to own and should own a home, and it's funny because that's not necessarily the way it always was. In fact, it was funny. I was watching. See, here's where I get some of my economic information from. I was watching "It's a Wonderful Life" last night or yesterday, I think it was, and if you remember in that, Potter, the bad banker, he was taking advantage of Jimmy Stewart, who owned the building and loan. That's the old savings and loans, right? Well, a couple things was interesting, and I'm old enough to remember some of this. The savings and loans got some of their money from commercial banks. In other words, they did borrow money periodically. It wasn't all from depositors. They would obtain money. In those days, the building and loans actually, in some cases, constructed homes or were actively involved in financing the construction of homes, uh, and for people to occupy. But the alternative then was almost always that you were renting, you were leasing your home. It was more common. People couldn't afford home ownership, so it was more common that people leased a home. Now, the, the interesting thing is that uh, you know the, is that at some point we decided that everybody not only should have the ability to own a home, but should own a home. That we were going to encourage home ownership. And for years, our tax code, again, a lot of this comes down to taxes. Our tax code has supported the purchase of a home as opposed to the rental of a home by allowing you to deduct the interest and the real estate taxes and other things, and kind of didn't encourage or discouraged renting. An individual didn't get any deduction if they were renting their home. Now, the person that was renting it to them got a deduction, but the person that actually was paying the bill didn't have any help. So it made it cheaper to buy a home than to actually rent a home, and you could get a better quality, lower priced home. I mean, a better quality, higher priced home if you purchased it because you got a tax deduction for the interest expense, which in effect meant that the government was paying for a portion of the transaction. And and our country largely has been built on real estate. And it's funny because people focus on the stock market, but the stock market has never really been the source of long-term wealth. We think of the robber barons or the industrialists that started the industrial revolution that started all of that, and we think, oh well, what about the Rockefellers, what about the Vanderbilts, and what about and the railroads, and it was all about the steel, the stock value of their company, the value of their companies. No, it actually wasn't. When you start looking at it, a lot of that had to do with the real estate that they purchased in connection with that business. And most small businesses, frankly, and I deal with a lot of small businesses, when it comes time to sell, the value of what they get when they sell is the real estate that they own. I guarantee you that if you have a business for 30 years and you don't you haven't at some point purchased the real estate that you're occupying out of, that you're not going to get as much money as you could if you had purchased that real estate. Why is that? It's not necessarily fully for the value of the real estate, but real estate is good collateral for borrowing money. So if I want to buy a business, and let's say I've got a business and the real estate that that business is operating out of is $1 million, and the value of my business is another is let's say another 300 to 500,000, right? Well, if I have to borrow the money separately, I'm the buyer and I'm borrowing the money separately to buy the business, or I'm just funding it separately. The the best I'm going to do, if all I have for collateral is the goodwill of the business, its customer base, maybe some inventory, the longest I'm going to be able to finance that is probably over 10 years, and maybe even less. So if I'm financing a $500,000 purchase over 10 years, right? My payment's going to be substantially higher than if I'm financing a $500,000 purchase over 25 years. And the SBA will give me 25 years to pay that off if I have some sort of real estate collateral. So when, as a buyer, I go in and you're saying I want 500,000 for my business, and I'm not going to sell the real estate. Well, if I'm looking at that, I'm going to say, you know what? That's a pretty stiff payment. I can't pay this thing. I can't pay your business off over 10 years at 500,000. I'll only give you 400,000 or 450 or whatever. I'm going to drop the price because I can't afford the payment. I've got to get the payment down. In fact, I might back out of the deal completely just because I can't. It doesn't make sense. By the time I have to rent my facility now because I don't own it, and I'm having to pay you for the business, or the bank back for the business over a 10-year period of time, between those two things, I might not be able to, it doesn't make sense for me. I can't afford the transaction anymore. And that's a mistake a lot of sellers make. A lot of sellers want to hold on to their real estate and lease it back. Well, first of all, in the long run, that's not a good strategy, because in the long run, uh, you're the person you sold the business to is going to want to own their production facilities, and they're going to pay more over the long haul if they're paying rent. So they know that, and they don't want to do that. They might do it in the short run. They might do it for 5 years. They might do it for maybe even up to 10, but most likely they're going to do it no more than 5, and then they're going to want to do something different, and convert to something where they're building some equity. And so it doesn't make sense. So if I'm buying, I got to pay that off. I might not be able to afford it between what's now a rental for the property, which I don't own, and the purchase of the building over 10 years. I mean, the purchase of the business over 10 years, I can't afford it. But if I structure this whole deal as a purchase of the business and the real estate, first of all, the SBA will probably be the one that's financing. Unfortunately, the government's financing everything nowadays. But I can probably borrow almost up to 100%, at least up to 80%. But in effect, maybe a little more between the property, leasehold improvements, and some equipment. I can probably finance that over a 20 to 25-year period of time. Now my payment has gone down substantially. My occupancy cost has gone down substantially. And I'm building equity in that at the same time. So so I'm going to go that route. That's what I'm going to do, because I can. It's a cheaper transaction for me. So now I can afford to pay you $500,000 for the business, because frankly, I can pay it off over that longer period of time. And even though I'm paying more with interest, and I understand all of that, from a cash flow standpoint, I'm not jeopardizing my business with a cash flow level that initially I can't afford. And in any transition of any business, it's not going to be immediately as profitable as it was previously. Now, hopefully, it's going to be more profitable ultimately. But when you take a business over, there's a learning curve. The new owner's got to get up to speed. There's a change in business sometimes, change in management. Sometimes that's a good thing, and it generates some business. But you've got a lot of previous customers that maybe are looking to change or moving around. So any transition of a business is always going to have a little bit of uh, a short term at least uh, difficulty in terms of cash flow. It's going to be tight because they've paid out a lot of that cash flow and a lot of that value. They've paid that out to the seller, and so that equity is not in the business anymore. They've had to pay it out of the business. So, for example, a lot of businesses, as we've talked about, they can't pull out all the cash that they've made. They have to leave it in there to support inventory, to support all those other things. So when that seller pulls all that equity out of there, which they typically do when they sell, it takes the new buyer a period of time to build that capital position back up again, and especially if the cash flow is such that they're paying a lot out for rent, they're paying a lot out for the purchase of the business. So that's that's kind of the basics of how business is transitions. That's why real estate has been so valuable over the years. And then, from a seller standpoint, if I've sold property in today's market and in any market, if I've sold property as part of my transaction, uh, first of all, the first thing I'm going to want to do is try to diversify that. But if I diversify that into other real estate, doing what's called a 1031 exchange, if I defer that into other real estate, I can defer potentially permanently, but I can defer the income tax on the gain from the sale of that real estate. Now, let me, kind of, a lot of people don't focus on this and what a big deal it makes. But let's say that I got $1 million transaction, and the taxes on that transaction would normally be, let's say the transactions, cost on that normally would be um, 20, 20%. Let's just say it was the old days, 20%, $1 million capital gain, long-term capital gain, I'm paying 20%. So that's the most favorable rates we've had on a transaction like that, is 20%. So you'd say, well, yeah, 20% is not that bad. I'll pay my taxes. But then what are you going to do with the money? You're just going to put it in a mattress someplace? Well, no, you want to earn a return on it, right? Because you're going to need that money to retire with or for some other purpose. So you need that money, even if you may need it to buy real estate down the road or to buy another investment, buy stocks, whatever. So you need, you know, you're going to need that money. Um, you sell it, you've got $200,000 on $1 million transaction. You've got $200,000 still that you got to pay to the government. So how much do you have to reinvest? Well, at that point, you got 800,000. You sold it for a million. Let's say you sold it for $1 million gain. You sold it for $1 million gain. You've got you paid 20% in taxes. You paid $200,000 in taxes. So you got $800,000 left to reinvest. Now, if if I've got if I earn 10%, that's a lot. I earn 10% on that $800,000. I'm going to make $80,000 a year. Let's say I've decided that's what I need to live off of, but I need to produce a 10% return on that $800,000 to be able to hit my number, to hit my $80,000 number. I have to, have to produce a 10% return. Now, let's say I didn't have to pay any taxes. Say I do a 1031 exchange, and instead of now having only 800,000, because I don't now have to pay taxes, I have $1 million because I didn't pay that $200,000 in taxes. I get to keep it. Now, I may have to pay it at some point, but the government is allowing me to keep it, right? So now I've got $1 million to invest, not 800,000. What do I need to make to make my 80,000? Only 8%, right? Okay, there's a huge difference between something that generates 8% and something that generates 10%. The risk factors on a 10% return are getting into the high risk areas of the potential of losing principal. Whereas 8% You know what? In real estate, historically, an 8% cap rate was kind of normal. So an 8% return in real estate was considered a reasonable return based on the risk involved. You'd have a mortgage, you got collateral, you've got a piece of property that, that's real property and it's in pretty good shape. So see how that transaction changes. So you've got to look at what you're going to do with the transaction. People say, well, I'm not going to do 1031 exchange. 200,000 is not that much, but $200,000 allowed me to take a lot less risk and earn the same amount of money, and I'm using the government's money to do it. So why not? And that's what generally has been done over the years. That's how wealth is created. You say, well, I need cash. I'm going to need some cash, so I got to have some money. Well, um, you know I've got $1 million piece of property. I mean, I've got $1 million piece of property now that I purchased on the 1031 exchange. You know, if I need $100,000 cash or $200,000 in cash, I just go out and borrow it. I'm leasing the property out, so yeah, it's going to cut my return down a little bit, but I'm also going to have cash if I need cash. And I just allow that property to appreciate. Somewhere down the road, I refinance, maybe pull out a little more cash, and then eventually sell it, do another 1031 exchange, and hopefully hold it until I die, and I don't pay any income tax at all. So that's kind of how it works. That's how historically the industrialists, made their money. They really were not industrialists; they were real estate people, and they made money off of real estate. Think about the FEC railroads, the old Seaboard Railroad, which was owned by the Vanderbilts in the day, I think. You look at that and think how much property they own. I mean, the Bright Line is a successful project largely because of the rental income that they're generating off of property in Miami and Fort Lauderdale that previously wasn't generating any significant return. So the train station in Miami is an entertainment center. That's what it's designed to be. It's got restaurants and it's got theaters and it's going to have all these other things too associated with it in multi-story high rises with rental property, and is scheduled to generate about $80 million a year in income just off of the real estate. That's a lot of money. So that's a big subsidy for that railroad. Why is that subsidy there? Because Brightline is still a real estate project. It is an entertainment and real estate project. It is not a transportation project. That's why people get all, you got these people attacking the concept of Brightline and attacking that as a transportation, and it's never going to work. Government transport, it's not intended to be transportation. It's intended to be entertainment. And it's like I always said, back in the day when Vegas was getting going, who was going to the desert? Who was really going to go to the desert? Why would you put an airport in Las Vegas at the time? Why? Nobody wants to fly to the middle of the desert. Well, and who's going to pay the prices it would cost to fly to the middle of the desert? Well, what happened? You got free airfare. If you agreed to spend a certain amount of money in the casino in the day, you got free airfare. To this day, if you're a fairly significant gambler, you can go to a lot of places that have casinos for very little cost. You're going to get that subsidized. Why? Because they're going to make way more money off of the gambling than they're going to make off of the transportation. They don't care about the transportation. They care about what they're going to make off of their primary product, which is the casino. Uh, and that's why people got confused here with the whole Brightline thing. If you want to see if Brightline is going to be successful or not, and I've been saying this for a long time, if you want to see if Brightline is going to be successful or not, look to see what happens in the Florida state legislature as it relates to gambling, casino gambling. And if it turns out that the legislature allows unlimited casino gambling, not just the Seminole casino gambling. They have a monopoly on that subject right now. So they have no incentive to do any of these other things because they don't have to. They get the money no matter what. and they can get you there no matter what. And you can't go someplace else. But if all of a sudden all of those hotels down in South Beach and along the southeast coast here of Florida can have casinos, think about how profitable that's going to be for Brightline in getting them, because they own that property and they own a lot of those their entertainment property down there, and they will own casinos. Trust me, they will own casinos or interest in casinos. Um, Ultimately, their whole purpose is to bring people from Disney to Miami and Fort Lauderdale to gamble. And that's all it is. It's transportation. Disney isn't going to probably have casinos on property. You're not going to go to Disney World and probably gamble. They don't currently have gambling, I don't believe, on their cruise ships yet. So you're not going to go to the cruise ship. But everybody else is. They're going to take transportation to get. So how do you get now from Disney to a cruise ship in Port Canaveral? Well, you take Brightline because it's going to go straight out to the port. How do you get to the casinos in Miami from Disney? You get on Brightline, you get down there, and and people say, well, how much? Cost for a family? That's going to cost. Not really. I mean, when you're going to Disney, are you worrying about another $1,000? If you've flown here from South America or flown here uh, from Europe, you're spending 15, 20, $25,000 on your vacation. You going to worry about another couple $100 to get down and do some gambling and spend some time at the beach? No, you're not. If you're serious about gambling and you're in Orlando to see Disney and you want to go do some gambling on the coast, you're not going to consider it. It's just part of your trip. It's part of your entertainment, and that's what's going to happen. And if you haven't been paying attention, there is now you'll see a number of people on the street right now asking you to sign a petition uh, in favor of allowing casino gambling to be on the ballot. And the whole purpose of that. So if you're if you're opposed to Brightline, you shouldn't be signing that petition, because that petition is all about being in favor of a Brightline. It just doesn't say it on the petition. It's based on the thought that you're really just voting on allowing casino gambling. And a lot of people don't have a problem with casino gambling. They don't have a problem with allowing that in Florida. It's a great generation of revenue. We need revenue in the state like anybody else. We've got the climate for it. It's just one more tool that brings more people to Florida for vacation and helps support our economy. So a lot of people are in favor of that. But if you're not in favor of the train, then don't vote to put that on the ballot, because if that thing gets passed, that's going to be the success of Brightline. If it doesn't get passed, I guarantee you there'll be less expansion of Brightline immediately because of that. So keep an eye on that if you want to know, if you kind of want to see what's going to happen with all of that. People say, well, yeah, the train's a dead issue. It is. And it is a dead issue from the standpoint of stopping it. But it's not a dead issue from the standpoint of, if it doesn't make an economic sense, reducing the impact of it. They're not going to run a train every hour or every half hour from Orlando to Miami if it's got no passengers. And if the casino gambling thing doesn't go through, there will be far less passengers going to South Beach and into Miami. Granted, the Seminoles will probably still have a right to have casinos, and so some people may be traveling down to one of the Seminole casinos, but that's not going to be the same as going down to see major entertainment, major shows, and major gambling at a Atlantic City or Las Vegas style casino, and that's what'll be down there, and there'll be a bunch of them down there initially. So here I'm not talking about the politics, but the economics of this transaction, if you search through it and look at it and really get to the economics of this transaction, that's how you can gauge whether or not that Brightline will have an impact. Um, there's a lot of smoke screens up there. Some people say it's freight. Um, FEC doesn't want to run freight up the coast. They would prefer not to do that. They've already asked to run it up the middle of the state. If it was just about freight, they would run it up the middle of the state. Many of you may remember when they asked to do that, and Senator Negron was opposed to that. He didn't want them running that up through the state, and I understand that would have had an impact probably on what we were doing up here from a water standpoint, potentially. They would have been coming up through the Everglades, and that probably wasn't a good thing from the standpoint of moving water south. But at the same time, that's where they would rather go. So, uh, you know, that's the freight side of it. The coastal side is nothing more than entertainment. And that's the private side. That's the and that's it. And they probably prefer that all the freight's off the tracks. If all you're running passenger, it's a whole lot easier because passenger trains are faster, and so therefore they're not going to block the crossings as much, and you don't have to time them. There's not as much timing involved. Although, for at least the near term, one of the reasons that Brightline did what they did, and as many of you know, the Brightline was originally owned by the same hedge fund, basically, that owned FEC. Uh, so Brightline didn't own the tracks; that was owned by a separate and distinct company that ran basically autonomously. But the hedge fund owned both, so it was actually owned originally by the same entity. One of the things that was a synergy with that for the hedge fund was they were looking at, from an investment standpoint, they were looking at the freight side, having to convert and all of their engines to a GPS based system so that all of that could be tracked and timed and scheduled through. Uh, and that was and it was a safety thing that was passed by the federal government to make sure that trains, try to reduce the number of crashes and those kind of things. So they had a deadline for that, and they were going to have to spend millions and millions of dollars. Uh, Brightline was going to put in that same infrastructure. So that was a side benefit to FEC. So that's one of the reasons that they were, willing to lease their tracks for that reason, because of that additional benefit of getting that infrastructure in place. Um, and so that's where it's at. Um, the I'll mention, just since I mentioned infrastructure, the other side effect of this is, or the other thing that has kind of thrown a monkey wrench into this thing is, even if economically it turns out that the casinos don't get passed, unfortunately, Brightline won't go away as fast, or won't be reduced as fast, because the government is going to throw money at it to encourage inefficient transportation. That's what the government does. They don't make things. They don't really do things. They don't invest, even though they like to use that term when they're spending our money, because it just sounds better than saying, "Hey, we're going to spend all your money on this project. We're going to invest your money in this project." Well, what's my return going to be? Well, you don't get a return. That's never coming back. But it's an investment. Trust me, it is an investment. But this transportation is inefficient for that purpose. We don't care. It's transportation, infrastructure. Even the Republicans think we should fund that. They're idiots, but anyway, they think we should fund that. And so, as a result, there is going to be a lot of inefficient transportation and inefficient infrastructure coming up in this world, um, that is going to be fostered by this tax bill, supposedly tax bill, and spending bill that just got passed. So, but in the long run, if there is no significant anchor, which is the casinos, if there is no significant anchors in South Florida, the Bright Line train doesn't make sense. So it goes away economically. So you don't have to fight it politically. You can fight it economically just by making sure that there's no casino gambling in Florida. Now, frankly, that probably hurts us and costs you a lot of money because you're going to pay more in taxes, sales taxes, real estate taxes, and other stuff. Um, where the casinos will be chipping in tons of money to pay that. But again, if you're that opposed to Brightline, there's where your fight is. Your fight's on economically is on that side, and it's the casinos. It has nothing to do with transportation. Don't try to tell them how, it doesn't make sense and it's not a good investment, and who cares? They don't care about it. It's a great investment for them if they can own some casinos and get money down and get some people down there to spend. So, so we've talked about that a little bit. I wanted people to look at that. The other issue is inflation, and we've been talking about inflation, and we've got a serious issue with inflation now. And here's why inflation is not the current inflation is not temporary. Uh, and there's a misnomer about inflation and wages. Um, the misconception is not misnomer, misconception. The misconception is that wages wages cause inflation, and uh, and that's not true. It's not wages that cause inflation. Actually, wages are the reaction to inflation. Labor tends to be a lagging indicator of inflation because labor costs are the last things that get raised, because once you raise them, you can't reduce them. So we've talked about the fact that, for example, uh, a corporation doesn't pay taxes. It can't pay taxes. And everybody knows it can't pay taxes. And we're seeing the economic reality of that right now, by the way. All of this discussion of taxing corporations, you'll notice that all of the all of the corporations that have monopolies or oligopolies, all the big tech companies, all of that, they're not opposed to a minimum tax. They're not opposed to corporate taxes, corporate minimum taxes, corporate taxes that they have to pay. Why is that? Well, because they know they can pass that cost along in higher prices. They can convert the tax to inflation. And that is going to be the case. Any business that does not have serious competition, either the competition they have are spread out and weak and small, or developing, or they just don't have them, or the ones that they do have are very large. Maybe there's only a couple of them and they're very large, so they're not going to attack each other. There's no incentive for them to attack each other because they can pay those taxes and increase their revenues at the same time and make more money in effect by passing it along in higher prices, and the consumer has to pay. How many consumers are going out right now and giving up their iPhone? No, you're not, right? Even though there's alternatives, but there's not a lot of alternatives, right? You basically got an Android phone or an iPhone, and that's it. And Apple has done a tremendous job in convincing people that they're not smart enough to know how to use an Android phone, and they really need to suck it up and use an iPhone. And I've gone there now too. Why? Because half the people you're dealing with have iPhones, more than half, about 90% of the people you're dealing with have iPhones. And so they have FaceTime or they have whatever. And even though Google and Android phones have the exact same concepts, you have to have a phone to know how to connect to that, and Apple doesn't allow that because they've got a monopoly on their systems. So so anyway, so the big companies, they're not going to get hurt by this. They're passing this along as increased prices, and it's not going to affect anything. They don't get impacted by labor costs. They pass those labor costs on. Um, they're not they're not impacted by any of those things because they just pass the cost along so they can produce the same or better return to their investors. So so a corporation has costs. Taxes are a cost. They've got to cover those somehow. Um, Labor's a cost. Materials are costs. Equipment is a cost, or some sort of technology, whether it's artificial intelligence, whatever it is. All of those things are costs for them. And if one of those costs go up, then some other cost has to go down, or the price has to go up. So, um, so typically, corporations will they've already tried, if they're in a competitive environment at all. Now, again, these big, large corporations like Apple and Google and all that, they're not in a competitive situation. So they do not have to, there's no incentive for them to minimize their costs, because whatever their costs are, they're going to pass it on in the price. So they don't have to buy the cheapest materials. They could buy all American. They could buy American materials produced with American labor. And if those materials cost them 6 times what it would cost them if they had the product produced in China, they're okay with that. Why? Because they can charge you 6 times. That's why an iPhone costs more than a computer. And there's no discounts anymore. Why? Because they can. So so they but competitive businesses have already reduced their material costs, because to be competitive, they have to keep their prices down. They can't pass it along in inflated prices. So they've already reduced materials costs. They might be able to reduce materials quality, which would reduce it further, but they have to walk a line there, because if they produce a product that's defective, they're out of business. So, General Motors, had it not been supported by the U.S. government under the Obama administration, would no longer exist today, because they produced a cheap car called a Volt that doesn't work with and doesn't do what it's supposed to do, and actually uses more energy than it saves. And yet it's still around. Why is it still around? Because the government subsidized them and saved them when they were going out of business. Otherwise, they would be gone, and we would have more Teslas, and we'd have more things that are more efficient in the use of energy. But and we would have gotten to that place a lot faster. Why are we not? Because the government decided that General Motors was too big to fail, just like they decided Citicorp was too big to fail. But anyway, so materials costs are already reduced to the point that they're walking a line between quality and quantity, or quality and price. So that's already been reduced. Many businesses have already, reduced their equipment costs, or have mechanized to the point of being able to reduce labor costs. So I mechanize, or I use artificial intelligence, because it eliminates my labor costs. And so therefore, once my labor costs are gone, that's a cost now that I don't have to bear, and I can't pass it up, but I don't have any labor costs. So there again, labor's bearing the cost of that. They're the ones that are going to suffer. They're the ones that are the last in the thing. That tend to get reduced, or increased least, increased last, and reduced first. Um, but So I've got artificial intelligence out there. It costs money to develop artificial intelligence, robotics, and all of that kind of thing, to reduce my labor costs. It costs money to do that. So I'm not going to spend that kind of money to implement this all over the place, even though I have the technology to do that, because right now I don't save enough money for it to make sense. But if wages start to go up, if wages start to increase, for example, if I'm McDonald's and I've got a $15 minimum wage, right? McDonald's can't make money. They can't even break even at a $15 minimum wage. So what are they going to do? Well, in the short run, politically, they may have to do something, and they have. So in the short run, they've increased their costs. But what also have they done? Well, any of that have been to a McDonald's, Taco Bell, any of those places now, what do you see when you come in? Not the nice smiling face behind the counter. You see a kiosk that tells you how to order, and you can have it your way. And you can put with or without pickles, and you can do whatever you want to do, and you're allowed to do that. and you don't ever have to go talk to that person behind the counter. Frankly, that person behind the counter is just there for looks, and they will be gone shortly. Just as soon as minimum wage hits a point where it doesn't make sense to pay somebody $15 an hour to stand behind a counter and do nothing, or just take an order that can be done electronically. So those people are gone. McDonald's isn't as concerned about the minimum wage because they intend to get rid of all of their employees. They already have the technology to cook the product, to create to make the fries, to put everything together, to package it, to take your order. All they need is a person to deliver it to the table or to the counter so that you can pick it up. Okay? They're going to say, number 14, your order is ready. Number 14, your order is ready. By the way, a computer can say that. And that's then going to be up on a counter someplace, and you're going to be number 14, and you're going to walk up there. You're going to probably have to show somebody that's yours. So there's going to be a manager who's not really managing any people at that point. So they're not getting any real management skills that they used to get to be a manager of McDonald's. They're going to be people who are going to stand there and make sure the robots work. And so as a result, that's what's going to happen. And who's going to get hurt by that? Well, labor. Labor's going to be gone. Who's labor at a McDonald's? Young people, right? Many people, it's their first job. It's where they learn about labor. It's where they learn about getting to work on time. It's where they learn to deal with customers and how to handle that. And they learn customer relation skills. McDonald's has a university that helps them learn that kind of thing. McDonald's has been a creator of significant management talent because of the way they operated. That's going to be gone. That's a cost to our economy. When somebody like McDonald's no longer needs the labor, they no longer need Hamburger U, they no longer are teaching the next generation of managers how to do it. And those aren't managers of McDonald's. Those are managers of other businesses. They're people who are going to go on to good paying jobs. But those won't exist anymore. That avenue won't exist anymore. So yes, we increased the minimum wage to a very few people to $15, but we did not succeed in producing a better thing for the economy. So ultimately, what happens? Well, labor's last, and when I have to increase labor, it's permanent because you're not going to eliminate it. And that's what we're looking at right now, unfortunately, is permanent inflation that's going to be factored into the labor costs. So anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about it. I'm going to be in and out this next month. Some meetings and conferences and things that I have to attend. But we'll be here Wednesdays, 9 to 10 o'clock, either live or on Memorex, but we'll be here one of the two. So please join us, and thanks for listening this morning and joining our show. And thanks for listening to WSTU Digital 1450, Martin County's Heritage Station.